Stop for a moment, because there is something about your life that you may have dismissed too quickly, something you may have called random, temporary, or simply strange, when deep inside you always felt there was more to it than that, and the person who entered your life younger than you may have carried a purpose you were never meant to recognize immediately. You may have wondered why this person appeared when they did. Why their presence felt strangely familiar, why a simple conversation with them could stay inside your mind for days, or why their words sometimes reached places in your heart that people much older and more experienced could never touch, and what you are about to understand may completely change the way you look at that connection. You were not supposed to understand it at the beginning, because if you had known the reason immediately, you might have tried to control it, define it, question it, or walk away from it before the deeper meaning had time to unfold, and sometimes the most important people in your story arrive disguised as ordinary moments because destiny does not always announce itself when it enters your life. Maybe you remember the first time you noticed them, and perhaps nothing dramatic happened at all. Maybe it was only a glance, a message, a conversation, a laugh, a question, or a moment so small that you almost forgot it, yet something about that moment stayed with you, and you may now be realizing that the moment you thought was insignificant was actually the beginning of something you were not emotionally prepared to understand. There was something about their energy that made you pause, something innocent and unexpected, something that seemed almost out of place in the season you were living through, because you had already convinced yourself that you knew what kind of people belonged in your life, what kind of connections were worth your attention, and what kind of relationships would never matter. But then this younger person appeared and quietly challenged everything you thought you knew. You may have thought the age difference meant they had nothing important to teach you, yet somehow they revealed something about you that you had forgotten, because sometimes wisdom does not arrive wearing the face you expect. And sometimes the person you think needs guidance becomes the mirror that shows you the wound you have been carrying without realizing it. Perhaps you noticed that they made you feel lighter, and that frightened you more than you admitted, because you had become accustomed to carrying everything so seriously, protecting your heart, measuring your words, expecting disappointment, and preparing yourself for people to leave. But around this person something inside you began to loosen, and that small change was pointing toward a truth you were not ready to face. You were not being asked to become someone else for them, and you were not being asked to rescue them, because their purpose in your life was never about possession, control, or saving one another from every difficulty, but about awakening something that had been sleeping inside you for far longer than you realized. And the deeper you look at this connection, the more you may begin to understand why it appeared at exactly that point in your journey. There were things you had stopped believing in before they arrived, things like genuine kindness, unexpected loyalty, honest laughter, simple affection, emotional safety, and the possibility that someone could see you without demanding that you perform for their approval, and somehow this younger person reminded you of those things without even trying, which is why their presence may have affected you far more deeply than you expected. You may have asked yourself why someone younger could have such an impact on you, but perhaps that is the wrong question, because the real question is what part of you needed to be awakened by someone who carried a different perspective, a different rhythm, a different way of seeing the world, and a different kind of emotional honesty. Maybe they said something to you once that seemed ordinary at the time, but later, when you were alone, the words returned, and you suddenly understood that they had touched something hidden beneath your thoughts, and that is when you began to realize that some conversations do not end when the person walks away, because certain words continue working inside you long after the voice has disappeared. There may have been a strange pattern around this connection, moments when you thought you had moved on from it and then somehow crossed paths again, moments when their name appeared unexpectedly, moments when a memory returned without warning, moments when you dreamed about a conversation you had forgotten, and moments when life seemed to place you in the same emotional space again, almost as if something unfinished was quietly asking to be understood. You may have called those moments coincidence because coincidence was easier to accept than meaning, but deep inside you knew there was something unusual about the timing, and perhaps that is why you kept asking yourself the same question in different forms. Why did this person come into my life now? The answer may not be what you expected, because they may not have come into your life to stay forever in the way you imagined, and that possibility is important, because sometimes a person can be deeply significant without becoming a permanent character in your everyday life, and their purpose can be measured not by how long they remain but by what changes inside you because they were there. That is the part you may have missed. You were looking at the person, while life was trying to show you the transformation. You were studying their behavior, while your own heart was changing. You were wondering what they felt, while something inside you was asking what you had stopped feeling. And you were waiting for them to reveal their purpose, while their presence was already revealing yours. Maybe you had become too guarded. Maybe you had forgotten how to hope without guarantees. Maybe you had stopped allowing yourself to be surprised. Maybe you had become so focused on protecting your heart that you forgot your heart was created to experience more than protection. And then this younger person appeared. Not necessarily with grand promises, not necessarily with perfect words, not necessarily knowing the effect they would have on you. They simply arrived as themselves, and somehow their presence became a doorway into a version of you that had been waiting quietly behind all your defenses. There may have been moments when you felt almost protective toward them, and perhaps you interpreted that feeling as proof that you were supposed to guide them, but there may be another layer to the story, because while you were teaching them something about life, they were teaching you something about your own heart. They may have reminded you that being strong does not mean being emotionally unreachable. They may have reminded you that maturity does not require losing wonder. They may have reminded you that wisdom does not mean becoming cynical. They may have reminded you that you can know how painful life can be and still choose tenderness. That lesson is more valuable than you may realize. Because there was a time when you believed your pain had to make you harder, but their presence began showing you another possibility. Your pain could make you deeper without making you colder, and perhaps that is why this connection sometimes felt confusing. It was not simply about them. It was about you meeting a part of yourself that had been buried beneath disappointment. Think about the timing. Why did they appear after a period when you were emotionally exhausted? Why did they enter your world when you had stopped expecting anything meaningful? Why did their presence become noticeable after you had already decided that certain parts of your heart were closed? Why did something so unexpected begin stirring inside you precisely when you thought you were finished hoping? Maybe the timing was the message. You had been asking life for a sign, but you were expecting something dramatic. You were expecting a door to open. You were expecting a miracle to arrive. You were expecting a clear answer. Instead, the answer arrived as a person you almost overlooked. And there is something else you need to understand. You may have been important to them too, not because you were perfect. Not because you had every answer, not because you always knew what to say. But because sometimes people enter one another's lives carrying pieces of encouragement they do not realize they are delivering. Maybe your presence gave them confidence. Maybe your words helped them see their own value. Maybe something you said during a difficult moment became a sentence they remembered later when they needed strength. Maybe your kindness reached them at a time when they were quietly questioning themselves, and perhaps you will never know the full impact you had, because some of the seeds you plant in another person's life grow in places you will never see. That realization can change the way you remember this person. You do not have to reduce the connection to a label. You do not have to force it into a category. You do not have to demand that it become something it was never meant to be. Sometimes the deepest connections are not asking you to possess another person. They are asking you to recognize what their presence awakened. And there is a reason you are thinking about this now. Something has shifted. Perhaps you have recently noticed their distance. Perhaps communication has changed. Perhaps life has separated you.